Rami Sabeh, who plays Sami Zayn, also played El Generico. It's like two different roles, but in a world where somehow the roles actually connect.
Welcome to the Delos Diaries, where we explore the untamed frontier of writing and creativity. Join your host, Paul Delos Santos, a writer and self-published author, as he navigates the ever-evolving world of storytelling.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the latest episode of the Delos Diaries. I'm your host, Paul Delos Santos, and I'm here today joined by Jen McGee. Jen, how are you doing today?
I'm doing good today. Thank you for having me on. I love to talk some writing and some wrestling.
Of course, those are two passions of mine. I think people will slowly understand that as they follow me on Twitter or various other places. They know that I'm, kind of a wrestling fan in various ways. I mean, kind of almost to a level that seems a little obsessive of how much I, well, go to the lengths and kind of enjoy
I'm not
Japanese
one
pro
to
wrestling
judge.
particularly. Oh, particularly Japanese pro. Ever since I started into it, I got really into that. So it's my favorite promotions are all based on there. So, but first, first question, always start off with the same one.
Mhm.
How did you get into writing? Like, it's kind of like this weird thing that, most people just kind of just jump in. And for you, it seems like a different story.
I started kind of slowly on writing. I had done a lot of academic writing
Hmm.
because I got my PhD. So obviously, I got my way through the PhD. And I'd done some writing for like journals, but that's a really different, very sort of technical kind of writing. And I don't know, it just never seemed like something that I could do. And I don't know why,
Hmm.
because I had done plenty of it for academic stuff. But I started writing just for web pages for my own enjoyment, just because I wanted to write some stuff about wrestling.
Hmm.
And I just got more and more comfortable writing, and the writing started to kind of hang together and kind of
Hmm.
become a history.
Yeah.
And eventually I started feeling kind of like maybe I could actually put that all together into an
Hmm.
actual book. And very kindly, my publisher, Jonathan Snowden from Hybrid Shoot, got in touch with me
Hmm.
and actually asked if I would be interested. So I didn't have to make a pitch. He came to me and suggested that we work together, and it went very smoothly from there.
It's funny you mentioned, the academic writing portion of things. I mean, a lot of people, don't realize whatever they start writing it that they're a writer. I think that's the one thing that feels like so different. Like you think, oh, I'm a journalist. I'm not really a writer because that's
But of
literally just
course, you're
something.
writing, yeah.
Yeah, you're still writing. I'm a technical writer. No, I write history papers. I write academic papers. It's like, no, you're still writing. You're still using a different side of your brain. So for you, how was it different from the perspective of like going from that academic writing, which is very research based and everything else, and then applying it to the same kind of structure of just doing it so in a how should I put this in a way that kind of can translate to a pro wrestling article, so to speak. And then before you really talk about your book in a second.
I mean, the ability to do research actually ended up being really helpful because I was trained to hunt things down and find information and sort of ferret it out.
Mm-hmm.
When I told my father's a teacher, and when I told him I was writing a book, I think the first thing he asked was, "Is it going to have footnotes? Are you going to actually cite your sources?" Yes, yes, Dad. I will cite my sources. I promise. So that really helped, that is getting me ready to think about how to do the research and put information together and explain how it all hangs together. So it ended up being a really useful skill. It didn't help me learn how to describe a wrestling match,
Hmm.
but it really did
Yeah.
help with how to do the research and put together a history.
Yeah, no, and that's the thing. That's what the most compelling thing about I've only read part of your book. I got it on like but when we were recording this, I got this on Tuesday,
Oh
and
wow.
I started reading it, and it's just one of those things where I'm just like, okay, this is very digestible. I
Oh,
think
that's good to hear.
that's the good thing for me is that it's very digestible because especially when you talk about like a story as complex as the one you talk about in your book, which is I'm going to try and I'll explain it like in some way later on, but I mean
Hmm.
overall to the non like wrestling fan, but
Yeah.
overall like it's just one of those things where it felt like the just the way it's being told, like overall, just when you dived into the story, particularly about the two, like we'll call them characters, so to speak. What really interests you about the story, so to speak, before we get into it a little more?
I think part of I actually was a really late bloomer as a wrestling fan. I
Hmm.
didn't get into wrestling until I was in my 30s.
Oh, wow.
Uh, and I actually, everybody assumes that I was a
Lifelong.
Generico, El
Yeah.
Generico, and Sam and Kevin Steen fan from way back, but I wasn't. I only really connected with wrestling in 2014
Okay.
when Sami Zayn was starting to get.
Mhm.
He was doing a run for the title in
Yeah,
the
this is a redemption
promotion.
arc.
Yeah, and I loved Sammy right away. And in part, what I loved about him was you could really feel that this was a character with a huge weight of history behind him. That is, he showed
Mhm,
up, and you could already tell like he'd been all over the world. He had history with some of the wrestlers that he was interacting with. It just really he felt very real in a way that some of the characters at that time didn't, because they were people just kind of, hi, I'm an evil cheerleader sort of approach. It
mhm,
was taking them a while to figure out what they were, and I
mhm,
never got that feeling with Sammy.
mhm,
So when Kevin showed up, I could really feel that there was this huge long history between them. And for people who aren't into wrestling, what happens is that Sammy wins the title, and this new wrestler who has just debuted that evening comes running to the ring to embrace him. And he has gotten injured earlier. He's broken his nose, so he starts bleeding all over
mhm,
Sammy, completely unscripted. And they're so filled with joy. You really can feel that they've worked so hard to get here, and it's this huge cathartic joyous moment. And then I think 6 minutes and 40 seconds later,
yeah.
Kevin suddenly attacks him, hurls him onto the ramp, stands over him, dripping blood down on him, his eyes gone totally dead. And you could just really feel, oh, this is a cycle.
Mhm,
This is a thing they've gone through lots of times before, and it's continuing into the future. And I was just amazed. I was hooked. I was
mhm,
like, I have to find all of the information about these two. I have to know, how did they get here? What does it mean?
mhm,
In wrestling, you get these incredibly long histories because they unfold in real time.
mhm,
The example I always give is, you can never, in a book, you can start with, as Kofi Kingston waited to go out at WrestleMania, he thought
mhm,
back over the last 20 years of his career. It had been a
mhm.
long and hard journey, but here he was. But in wrestling, you have to actually show
The journey.
every single minute
Mhm.
of those 20 years. You can't do an info dump and just get there. So it's a really unique and very strange and very rewarding kind of storytelling that was really fascinating to dig into.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. You kind of touched on it a little bit, but it's like, and everyone asks me why I enjoy Japanese pro wrestling longer. It's because of the just the inherent nature of Japan, which is loyalty to a company. So you
Hmm.
see these guys when they start off as young lions, and they eventually grow into the main event as you see, and they see the cohesive narratives that go
Yeah.
into that. And I think that's one of the beautiful things about pro wrestling. But in America, it seems a little more disjointed at times because you will go stretches where they're separated. But with Sammy and Kevin, it really feels like there wasn't a lot of time to breathe in between their separation, because I think it's like I don't know the exact timeline of like when Sammy signed with the WWE, and then Kevin probably like I would say less than a year to a year after.
It was about a year and a half,
Yeah,
yeah, which was
yeah.
the
So it's like you
longest they had ever not
been
wrestled each
separate.
other.
Yeah, it's a
Yeah.
long separation, and I think that gave the story its reset. As we go through
Hmm.
we go through a perspective of the constant, like, ups and downs roller coaster, which we'll get into in a second. But when approaching a pro wrestling story, so to speak, how did you approach it from the perspective of a traditional narrative? Because you do run into these situations where, like, a good example would be Cody Rhodes.
Hmm.
I think the fact remains that without that long the journey doesn't really begin at his start of his career, but rather when he leaves.
Hmm.
And that's when the story really begins. So, I mean,
The
how do you take a
hero's
pro
journey
wrestling?
to strike
Yeah,
out on your own. Yeah.
yeah, just like one of those things where it's really strange to me, like how hard was it initially for someone who came in late to really like put together the pieces of the story?
It's really hard. Wrestling
Mhm,
is simultaneously extremely easy to
mhm,
get hooked on and incredibly hard, because it's very easy because it's really emotional. it's acted at top volume, so you can't miss that this is the good guy who's fighting and this is the bad guy. And the simple outlines of a story are immediate and obvious, pretty much. But then as you get into it, you start realizing, oh, this is referencing a promo from 2 years ago that, I have to go find now. Yeah, a lot of the complications with Kevin and Sammy's story is that a lot of their matches are really hard to find. They wrestled, for some promotion in Italy that existed for 4 weeks and then disappeared.
Mhm.
And there's no footage of it left. Sammy's wrestled in Poland and Chile in front of 40 people, and there's
Mhm.
no record of it at all. So that makes it incredibly hard to put together a story in some ways. But they compensate for it by tending to put a lot of repetition into a story too.
Yeah.
So that you can tune in and realize what's going on pretty quickly, usually.
Yeah. I think that's the beauty of Kevin and Sammy's story. I think, for those who don't know pro wrestling, it's these two go like for the purposes of simplifying their story is that imagine two athletes, same city, I believe same training area.
Hmm.
Just they grew up together, friend slash rival. Because it's one of those things where in athletics, you always look for that you always look for that story. They're pushing each other. But in pro wrestling, because it's such a both competitive but also compa- com-
Collaborative.
cooperative, it's like this weird middle spot. So it's kind of like it's a very cutthroat industry, but also this. You still have your friends, so it's this weird situation that you feel like, and I think it comes through in their storytelling where they like it's one of those, and I think that's the easy way to put it. Is like they're just friends and rivals. Then this is their story. This is their careers, and they
Yeah.
made it to the biggest stage they could possibly make it in together.
Hmm.
And I think that's the easiest way to put it. But for me, the one thing that I always viewed it as is that like I think it's on the back cover. It's like am I better with you or am I better without? Like
Hmm.
that saying on the back of the book, and I'm like it really makes me think. Like how their story doesn't really take spot without each other.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I've always kind of felt like if they hadn't run into each other, they would have done okay,
Hmm.
but they never would have made it as far as they did. They were constantly pushing and pulling each other, and every time one of them was doing better than the other one felt, I think, a lot of pressure to catch up.
Hmm.
Like when Sammy made it to WWE and Kevin didn't for about a year. You can really see if you go back and look, Kevin just absolutely dedicates himself to he's doing interview after interview, basically auditioning constantly, talking about how he's ready for this, he understands what it would take, and just sort of pushing really hard to get there, to in order to catch up to his rival and his friend. Yeah, every time one of them looks like they're going to move away from the other one, they catch up. I
Hmm.
was really worried. So what happens is after Kevin shows up in WWE, it looks like they're almost ready to come up from developmental to the main roster together. And then Sammy gets terribly injured, rips up one of his shoulders.
Yep.
And while he's recovering, Kevin catches fire. He comes up to the main roster. He wins a bunch of championships. He does incredibly well while Sammy is still really stalled out. And at the time, I was like, oh, I guess that's that, Yeah, Sammy can never catch up now. And he has. In the last
Mhm.
few years, he's been champion a bunch of times while Kevin hasn't. He's been involved in some of the most compelling stories in ways that Kevin hasn't as much, although he's done great too.
Mhm.
And so once again, I actually feel like they're on really equal footing right now, which is
Mhm.
really fascinating. Yeah.
What's even more fascinating is that you mentioned that it seems like fortune and fate has its own way of intertwining, and then you
Hmm.
mentioned the shoulder injury that he suffers in Montreal against
Yeah.
John Cena. A few weeks later, Kevin shows up on Raw beats
Yep.
John Cena. It's like fate intertwined so perfectly to kind of get them back on, equal footing. It's like, oh, Sammy's gonna have his run on the main roster. Tears his shoulder out on his introduction, on his entrance. Bad luck. Kevin comes in, and skyrockets.
Spin. Yep.
Yeah, skyrockets, and it's just insane to me how just cohesive this all. It's almost like it's the perfect story. If you ask me, like,
Yeah.
there's few perfect stories in pro wrestling, and if this is the end of Kevin, as he goes through his neck injury, if this is really,
Mhm.
if that match in February goes down as one of his last, I think that would be a very fitting end to Kevin
It was
Owens'
a great
career.
match. They
It
had
was, it
a
was fantastic. It was one of the
I was just
best.
looking it up. I think it's the longest singles match they ever had in WWE.
Really,
Yeah, it was 27 minutes long,
wow.
and that was the longest, maybe longest singles match at a pay per view
Yeah, yeah, that makes
that I
sense.
was checking. Yeah,
Yeah, no, that.
and it was really good. It
Mhm.
was a good match.
It was the safest extreme match they could possibly have because we've
Yep.
seen them do some crazy stuff over the course of their
Yeah.
history. I mean,
Yeah.
it's just, but overall, like when you're dealing with like the WWE property, it's always a difficult, conundrums. You're dealing with two guys who are in the probably the both the largest, but also probably one of the most protected IPs other than Disney. It
Mhm.
feels like. How
Yes.
was it in that process working? How much did you work? Did you get to work with Kevin and Sammy during the store, or was it completely independent of them?
It was pretty much completely independent of them.
Mhm.
My publisher worked really, really hard to have me have access to them, and not surprisingly, it
No.
just didn't work. Except at the very end, right after I finished it, suddenly, then WWE said, you can have one interview with them. So I did have a chance to talk to them. I had to turn it into like a coda at the end. I added it,
Yeah.
an addendum. Luckily, they didn't contradict anything that I had
Mhm.
written. Thank God. I don't know what I would have done if they had given me some totally different fact at that point.
Mhm.
But they added some nuance, some sort of feelings, and it made for a really good ending. But
Mhm.
no, luckily for me, Kevin had done a ton of interviews.
Yes, he did.
So his take on the story was out there in some form or another. And it was it wasn't easy to put together. But once you watch the 40 to 50 hours of him talking
Mhm.
about his career, you do start to be able to see where it's going. So that really helped a lot. So I
Yeah.
felt like I had interviewed him, even though I hadn't, because I got to see him talk to so many people.
Mhm. Yeah, it's weird, like, it's like, most of these, like, I think the biggest challenge to me when you're doing a story like this is the fact that you may have to go without access.
Hmm.
I think, which is the primary source of everything. As an academic, as a former teacher, who's, one of those things where I know about academic writing, the primary source.
Yep.
You're doing everything from secondary sources, and for not to be able to do this without the primary source almost feels like, it feels like you're missing something. And I'm glad that WWE gave you the opportunity to get that primary source feeling into it, because how relieved were you that you got that primary source interview? Because I feel like as an academic, it had to drive you a little crazy knowing that you did not have the primary source.
It was, yeah, it was tough. The one way I got around it, and the one thing that was a saving grace, is that this isn't. It's a very weird thing, and
Hmm.
if your viewers don't know much about wrestling, it's
Hmm.
hard to explain. But Kevin and Sammy are both real people and
Yeah.
characters, and so in the book, I'm really tracing more of their characters' history than the people's history.
Yes. Hmm.
But because, especially of who Kevin is, the real person and the character have a lot in common.
They do. They really do.
Sammy, on the other hand, you can see him there on the background
Mm.
behind me, the guy with the
Yeah.
cape. Sammy, for a long time, played completely. He was a
Hmm.
masked luchador who never spoke.
Hmm.
So completely imaginary character. Whereas Kevin always played somebody that was very rooted in who he really was.
Hmm.
So it was really interesting, and it helped that I mostly wasn't doing a history of the real people so much as a history of the characters.
I think that had to make it significantly easy. I
But
had to make it significantly easier. Like,
yeah,
and
it did
knowing, and
help
I
a
think
lot.
I think truthfully, there's too much. I think that the way wrestling media works these days is that it's either too far into preying into real life or too far. Like it's like, there's no real like mix. I
It's
think
difficult.
it's difficult. And I feel that your book so far, based on what I've read, is really doing a good job at mixing, like keeping it
I would
strictly
love to
to
hear
the
that. Yeah.
story it is, which is this self-contained story. Because it is a self-contained story. It's one of the it's one of the greatest modern pro wrestling stories that we have that spans so many years and
So many years.
so many matches that people haven't even probably seen,
Hmm.
and they just know about the history of these two and they don't really dive into it. I think your book does a great job at introducing the people who don't know that Sami Zayn was this um Mexican luchador
Mexican luchador.
who went down to Mexican luchador from Montreal, Quebec, Canada, who went down to save orphan children. Yep,
Yep.
that's exactly the story that he gave when when people ask about what happened to El Generico. But I think that's what makes this whole storyline so compelling is that you kind of have to look at it from like Sammy and El Generico are like the same person, but they're not.
They're the
It's
same
like this
person,
weird,
but they're not. It's really
yeah,
fascinating because I was just thinking, you're saying that it's a history of the characters, and yet you treat Generico and Sami Zayn like
the
they're the
same.
same person because I think
Hmm.
you kind of have to.
Hmm.
But at the
But they're
same
not.
time, yeah, they're not.
They're completely different.
The person who plays Sami Zayn will tell you that he is not El
El
Generico because
Generico.
he's not.
Hmm.
How do I put this? Wait, Sami Zayn is not El Generico.
Hmm.
Rami Sabeh, who plays
Is
Sami Zayn, also played El
mm, El
Generico. It's
Generico.
like two different roles,
Hmm.
but in a world where somehow the roles actually connect. It's because Kevin's still the same person
Yep.
interacting with these two characters played by the same person. It's
Yep.
weirdly complicated.
Yeah, and I think that's where a lot of pro wrestling, like non-pro wrestling fans, will get confused. I think that's the ultimate thing is that you have this character who played by a guy who knows this guy, and it's like their history, like it's like like ultimately you guys get to the story is that these two know each other from far beyond
Hmm.
simply just being two guys. I think it just
Yeah.
the story is just goes beyond that. But it is a weird place that you do put like a lot of non-wrestling fans. And so how do you approach that from a perspective that I know your book's geared to wrestling fans. There's no question about it. It's a geared
Yeah. There's no way around it.
100% book. Only people who probably read it will be pro wrestling fans.
Other
But
than my father.
oh yes, other than your father, yes. But for that perspective, like how did you approach it for your father per se? Because I think it's one of those things where you think about that one person who's probably just like, like your father who's never not interested in pro wrestling probably and just wants to read your stuff and kind of support you. And how was that approach? Like how do you kind of get him involved? Like how do you keep him in mind while writing, even though you're writing a primary wrestling fan book?
Actually, I was really helped out because my sister
Hmm.
was not a wrestling fan. She is now because Rhea Ripley won her over.
Yep.
But when I started writing, she was not a wrestling fan, and I would run my chapters by her just to see if they hung together as a story.
Hmm.
And it was so helpful. The biggest challenge is, of course, when you're describing a match, how to keep from getting bogged down in all of the move names.
Hmm.
Because it's really easy to be like, there was a moonsault and then a hurricane rana and then a Frankensteiner and then a power bomb and a DDT. And
Yeah.
to a wrestling fan, they can put that together, right? They
They can
can
put the string
see
together.
that in
Yeah.
their mind. But my father, as he reads my book, is really struggling with it, and there's no
Hmm.
way to completely avoid that. He keeps hitting these when he hits the descriptions of the matches. He's
Hmm.
just like, this is all. It's all a foreign language to him.
Hmm.
You try really hard to be like, he hit a moonsault, which means he curved backwards gracefully. Or, he hit a power bomb, slamming him onto the mat, so that you at least give a hint about what this means.
Yeah.
But it's one of those things that a wrestling fan is going to be able to see, and a non wrestling fan is just going to be like noise.
Yeah,
So
it's
it's a
like
real challenge.
it's a real foreign language to them. I think that's where the challenge will come in. Like ultimately, like when you do write something that's so geared toward, but it's also it helps you that you wrote in a niche where people are craving this types of information. I think that's the one thing is that like I said, like they always say write the book you wish you could read, and this is one of those books where I wish I could have read.
It very
I'm
much
glad you
is
wrote.
for me, yeah.
I'm glad you wrote it because it's a truly an analysis of a character based story that I feel like not a
Yeah.
lot of people do in pro wrestling. I mean, Like they always look at it from like the backstage angles. I'm like, that's
The
boring stuff.
business
I mean,
angle, yeah.
yeah, business. I'm just like, give me the stuff that we're watching and break it down conceptually like a true work of art. I think people always ask me why do you like because it's art. And it's just like it's just one of those things where it's a performance art that's highly athletic and highly dangerous. And, like there's
Mhm.
everything I want, except and I think it's weird how people still have this perception that just because it's predetermined, it's really not a sport. I'm like, no, it's actually probably one of the hardest things to do in this world.
It's like live stunt performances,
Live
you know,
stunt performances
with a story. Yeah.
plus acting and plus stringing
Mhm.
together a match and making it cohesive and have it make sense where things you did 15 minutes ago has to play into like the next five or
Yep,
stuff like
yep.
that. It's just so intricate in how things go. So when you're dealing with something as intricate as that, how much fun was it to deal with like the intricacies of this feud?
When it wasn't driving me crazy, it was
Mhm.
fun.
Yeah. Oh
It
yeah.
was really fun to watch a match and try to think, okay, what's the through line here? Because you can't get bogged down in describing every move.
Hmm.
So you have to figure out what's the plot of the match
Hmm.
and which moves have to be described to make the plot make sense.
Hmm.
Uh, I mean, because it was like writing a fight scene. You can't
Hmm.
skip a part and suddenly realize, oh wait, when did they get on the roof? I
Hmm.
didn't describe them getting onto the roof. And now
Hmm.
and then that would happen. I'd be writing it up, and then I'd say, and then he jumps up onto the table. I'm like, oh wait, damn, how did he get out of the ring?
Hmm.
He's off in the audience. I have to at least tell us how he gets out into the audience
Hmm.
somehow.
Yeah.
And so there was a lot of that sort of what's the minimum detail I can put in and still have it make sense.
Hmm.
Don't get bogged down, but still have it all connect somehow. Was really a fun challenge when it wasn't killing me.
Yeah, no, I trust me. I used to be a sports reporter, and sometimes you
I'm
just
sure.
get bogged down in the inside baseball terms.
Hmm.
And it's just like, and I think that's something that I kind of took for granted when I moved out of sports is that, I just assume my audience knows all the things about what I'm writing. And I think that's where sports writers kind of struggle with the most initially is
Yeah.
that attention to expanding detail. And it's just like, you say a home run. Okay, now describe a home run. Well, it's a home run. It's like,
It's a home
come
run.
on,
And what happens
you
if
know
you
what that is?
reverse? If you don't know
No,
what
they
a
run
home
around the
run is,
bases,
why
they
do
hit
you
the ball over.
reverse?
Yeah,
Yes.
it's stuff like that where I feel was that a challenge for you initially to kind of like when you approached it from that perspective? Was that the challenge of like like the inside baseball like in like a promo like explain what a promo is, what like a package pile driver versus a normal pile driver, just
Hmm.
all
Hmm.
those different things where it just it could easily bog you down and just you mentioned your sister was an editor. Was there any times when she was like editing your stuff and she's like, I have no idea where you're going with this?
She did now and then. She'd be like, okay, that was a lot of stuff in this section. That was a lot of moves all put together. Or sometimes she'd be like, this chapter had a lot of names in it of people that I don't know. And is there any way to kind of clean it up? Promotions.
Hmm.
There are a couple of chapters where they're working for 4 or 5 different promotions. And so my sister would be like, IWS, CZW, ROH,
Hmm.
AIW, AGP, PWG. What's going on here? What are all
Hmm.
these different things? And so it was really good to remind myself to try to pare it down as much as possible so that the page didn't just become acronyms,
Hmm.
because it really can when they were working so many different places. It was a real risk.
Hmm. I like how you mentioned earlier that you did get to speak with Kevin and Sammy. How receptive were they about you telling their story like this?
Oh, they were great, actually. It was really wonderful to talk to them. Um, I didn't have to ask them much, because if you
Hmm.
know much about them, you know that if you just ask a couple of questions,
Yes.
they will take off talking and just sort of and bicker,
Naturally bicker,
argue with each other a bit, and just feed off of each other a lot. And it's really interesting because, uh, contrary to what you might expect, they have done very, very few interviews together.
Hmm.
They've only done like 2 or 3, and they couldn't really do any when Sammy was playing El Generico because he couldn't talk. Um, and they've only been on the same page and in alliance for a little while here and there.
Mhm.
So the number of interviews they've done together is actually kind of low. But when they're on screen, they play off each other.
Yes, they
When
do.
they're working together as a team, if they're backstage, they're talking and they'll just keep talking. So they were really easy to interview because they knew more or less what I wanted. I felt like,
Mhm.
and they were very willing to talk about things in the way that I was hoping they would.
Mhm. Kinda open the door a little bit and, like, you get your peek in the
Yeah.
curtain.
Yeah, it was great.
I mean, you mentioned that you had a publisher, so how did you get in contact with Jonathan? I know Jonathan Snowden, I've read some of his stuff, so I know Jonathan Snowden is. It's
Mhm.
just how did you start this relationship with Jonathan? Because I know a lot of people, when they start a project, whether it's nonfiction or fiction, they typically don't have the luxury of being published through a publisher. They have to go through various other
Yeah.
means. So,
Yeah.
how was that relationship and how did that kind of go into more the inside baseball of the writing, which is what this podcast is about. So how did that relationship kind of snowball and build?
Well, I have a Twitter account where I post gifs of
Mhm.
wrestling, which is kind of where I started. I would post them and describe them and make threads. And Jonathan Snowden's wife, Christina, followed me, and she really liked the way I wrote about wrestling and about wrestling characters. So she suggested to her husband that he approach me and ask if I wanted to turn my information about Kevin and Sami into a book. So he
Oh.
did. And I said, hey, that sounds great. And then because I don't know anything much about writing, I was kind of like, this seems like a very random sort of thing. And I didn't know really what to do next. So I just said, sounds great. And then didn't do anything with it for months. And then pretty much when Kevin and Sami started interacting, and I realized, wait, this is probably going to lead to a tag team run. I suddenly was like, oh, wait a minute. I haven't been working on this book that I said I was willing to do. So I got back in touch with him and said, hi, are you serious about that? And that's when we finally started moving forward and getting a contract and some real plans, because I couldn't quite bring myself to believe that someone was willing to ask me to write a book for a long
Mhm.
time. So I stalled a little on that just because I couldn't get my head around it.
Mhm.
But once we got moving on that, it went really, really smoothly.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it comes down to just once again, I mean, a lot of people who've gotten publishing deals are always say it's going to be a lot of like luck. Making it, kind of being in the right place, right time, and doing the right
Hmm.
thing and putting yourself out there. So how
Yep.
was that initial like? And then you mentioned that you were like surprised and everything. Did you ever in your life anticipate that just posting gifts and telling a story from the gift point of view would lead to you having a book out and now enjoying like
No,
that
I
people are
really
getting to read?
didn't. And Twitter X is so fragmented that it
Mm-hmm.
was kind of hard to put a story together. But you end up with like 20 tweet threads, and so you can start to weave it together. But partially, I never thought that I would write a book because I had decided that I had to have the gifts so that I could say, look at this. This is what's happening. And the idea of writing without the crutch of the visual aid was
Mm-hmm.
kind of frightening. Um, I ended up working with a fantastic illustrator
Mm-hmm.
who was really good at capturing the feeling of some of the stuff. But it's not quite the same as having the
Yeah.
gift sitting right
Mm-hmm.
there next to your writing saying, look at the terror on his face for every
Mm-hmm.
single thing. So that actually was a real challenge, was how to write visually enough that you didn't need the GIF there to illustrate what I was saying. Um, and that took me a little while. It was like working without a net.
Mm-hmm. I think that has to be one of the most difficult and scary things about writing this book, I assume, is knowing how much you relied on the visual aspects because it is a visual
Mm-hmm.
medium because the very nuance of the eyes, the ears, the nose blood, the bloody nose from
Mm-hmm.
NXT, from Redemption, and it's just um. Like, how did you kind of overcome that fear? Like, a lot of first time authors will like question whether or not they have it or not. It's just like, how did you overcome it?
just stubbornness, I
Mhm.
guess. And trying to focus really hard on trying to be sort of visual and work in as much of the sort of visceral details, like, and considering the fact that occasionally a book did give you stuff that you couldn't put into a GIF, like I could describe what a place might smell like,
Mhm.
which you couldn't really do with a GIF, or I could really focus on the sound or
Mhm.
the feeling of things. And so I tried to remind myself not to just focus on how hard it was to capture the visuals, but instead to focus on the fact that I could really describe sounds or smells or other sensations, the
Mhm.
way the sound of a crowd hits you, you know?
Mhm.
And that helped me get past it, knowing that there were ways that this opened things up for me rather than closing things down.
Mhm. Like the research part, like how did you find the matches? Because it's always intriguing to me. How do you find some of these hidden gems, so to speak, of this feud? Because they're like everyone knows the big ones, like the ladder
Hmm.
matches and the tag team matches, and everyone knows the key moments, so to speak. Like if just as a comic book, the key issues, so to speak. But how do you find some of the smaller, like the more character development arcs, so to speak?
I still have never found El Generico's first match.
Oh wow.
I have never found it. I found very brief clips of it, and that had to do. It's from 2002, and
Mm-hmm.
to a crowd of like 100 very drunk people in Montreal. So it's just not out there. Some of it I got lucky with. A lot of the Ring of Honor stuff. I happened to be able to get in touch with somebody who used to work for Ring of Honor and still had files of most of their shows.
Mm-hmm.
For Kevin and Sami's very first match, that was another one that was recorded but never put onto a DVD. And it was a super important match because it's the match where, after wrestling Sami, Kevin decides that he has to quit his wrestling school and join up with Sami in IWS.
Mm-hmm.
And there was no version of it out there anywhere. I kind of gave up. I was very discouraged. And then out of nowhere, I got a DM from Kevin saying that he had seen me mention that I was sad. I was like, well, I guess it's my holy grail, but I will never see it. And I
Mm-hmm.
have to live with that. And Kevin asked his father to dig around in their closet and find the recording that had never been put on a DVD. And he found the VCR tape, sent it to Florida. Kevin, of course, did not have a VCR at that point. He got
Mm-hmm.
onto Facebook Marketplace and found a VCR, and then propped his iPad up in front of the computer and recorded their first match
Oh wow.
and sent it to me. And I've got it, it's on my YouTube now. And so I was actually able to see it. And I mean, that's just luck. And Kevin being a saint, you know.
Yes.
So I'm of all the stuff I've done, actually, I am super happy that because of my persistence, that match is out there and people can find it and watch it now.
Mhm.
And they wouldn't have been able to if I hadn't searched for it so hard that Kevin finally gave up and sent it to me.
Yeah. Well, that just tells you
Stop
about the
complaining
person.
about how you can't see it. Here it is.
I mean, that kinda has to tell you about the character Kevin. I think the
Yeah.
person, not the character. The
Yeah,
person who
yeah.
Kevin is. I mean, because
Non wrestling fans, Kevin's character is basically a dead-eyed murderer.
yep.
He
With
has times where he's a very good person, but at base he's basically a monster.
Mhm.
But oddly enough, and this is one of the fascinating things about wrestling that I think is very appealing, very often the most horrible and evil characters are played by the sweetest, nicest people.
Oh, yeah.
And that's always this amazing tension, is that these horrible, nasty people are out there to make little kids frightened so that they will be happy when the good guys win.
Mhm.
You know, there was some match once where Kevin was playing a bad person and he came out and ripped up a little kid's sign And after the match, the guy he was wrestling came over and hugged the kid and helped him pick up his sign. And you know that the Kevin did that knowing that eventually this kid would get, all of
Something.
the payoff there.
Mm.
It's
Yeah.
really interesting. I love that about wrestling.
Oh yeah, it's definitely great. And so no one told Kevin that he can just take the tape to a place and they can rip it to a DVD for. I just imagine Kevin putting the iPad in front of the TV with the VCR he bought off of Facebook Marketplace
Yep.
just to send you a footage to complete the story, so to speak. That
Yep.
just, to me, that speaks volumes
What
of
a what
how.
a gift. What a
Yeah, that
gift.
is
What a
just
great
that is
guy. I
incredible.
mean,
I mean, that is a cool story. I will say that's a cool aspect to. I mean, that's something that maybe maybe this will be one of the few times that it's out there that he did that.
yep.
I mean, how was this before or after the interview we did with him?
Oh, way before. This is like 5 years
Really?
ago. Yeah, like 5 years ago. It was ages ago.
So this is before you even met him in person or
Well,
Zoom?
I had met him. I had met him at meet and greets.
Yep. Yeah, sure.
Which they're like 2 minutes long. Like, hi,
Yeah.
nice to meet you. I'm
Mm.
Myth Gifts. Oh yeah, I've seen your stuff. Okay, great, thanks, bye.
Yep.
But we had met there in person, and we had interacted now and then. He had retweeted some of my stuff now and
Hmm.
then, so
Yeah.
he knew who I was. But it was way before I started this book. So yeah, he had no
That's
idea that I was going to write a book someday.
Oh, that had. Did you tell him that you're forever grateful that he did that for you?
Oh yeah, every chance I get.
Oh, that's fantastic. I mean, I'm gonna have to watch that match now because I truthfully am
Yeah, I will
interested to
share the
see.
link with you. It's wonderful. It's a
Awesome,
really
yeah.
good match too.
Really, for
Uh,
where they were in their careers?
you would think that it would not be a fantastic match. They were like 19, and it's when Kevin sent it to me, he sent a little note saying it's not great because we thought it was going to be our only match, so we just did all of our moves at each other. And yeah, it is there. They're sort of just spamming moves, but it's
Okay.
still really good. There's still definitely a story and a development to it that I think is just shocking considering they're 19 years old there.
Hmm.
It's
How long
amazing.
how long were they training up to that point? Off the top of your head? Yeah.
Well, Kevin was training in a different school
Hmm.
with Jacques Rougeau. Sami practically wasn't training at all. He paid somebody like $5 a week to teach him how to take bumps on grass. Uh, and Kevin was training with Jacques Rougeau, who would not let him wrestle for other promotions.
Hmm.
And then Rougeau got sick for a little while, let him wrestle for other promotions, and then told him he had to stop again. But by then, Kevin was kind of like, no, I think maybe I'll keep wrestling in other promotions. So
Hmm.
that was when he left his formal training,
Hmm.
basically.
Yeah.
And
And
so
then,
never had any formal training of any sort, really.
wow. So these are two literal generational talents who
Yep.
have just it's just who just gravitated, and I think that's what adds to your story as well, is that these two were
Yeah, it's
so
amazing.
good.
The odds of having two, and they were just very clearly a level above everybody else
Mhm.
right away. I think it's really clear. And so they just immediately gravitated to each other, even though they often cannot get along. They can't
Yeah.
stand each other sometimes, but because they clearly were going to be linked together if they both kept wrestling, they were like, well, I guess we've got a story now.
We need each other as much as
Mm-hmm.
and I think just through that, like, once again, the competitive cooperation of pro wrestling.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's just super weird. When it comes to writing, like, you mentioned academic writing. You mentioned that going from that style of writing to a more, for lack of a better term, flowery descriptive language
Mm-hmm.
versus the very direct. The very direct. In terms of soccer, it would be like two different styles. It'd be tiki taka versus just play the ball deep. Uh, just
Yeah.
like it's one of those things. So, was how difficult was that initial adjustment to like turn that academic brain off, knowing you're still doing like some type of academic writing? So you kind of have to like walk this fine line. Like, I did all this
Interestingly,
research.
it's changed my academic writing style.
Really?
Yeah, I've written a couple of small pieces for the local university journal,
Mm,
and looking at it, I can be like, that's not really academic style
mm,
now. I'm too fond of having a well turned phrase now,
mhm.
so I keep working in puns and stuff, and I'm like, that's not. Oh well, oh well.
Yeah.
It's for the local in house journal. It's okay. It's not going to get read widely, and no one's going to
I'm
look at it and go,
sure
what the
they're
heck is that?
enjoying it because it's a different style that they're used to.
It is really interesting, yeah. It took me a while, and my early writing has a lot of academic jargon in it that
Mhm.
I usually I tried to always stop and define what I was talking about, but you could really see my academic roots showing up. Let me talk a little bit about some postmodern theory now. I'll explain that. It was kind of fun. It was fun to take sort of very esoteric terms and apply them to people pretending to smash each other in the mouth.
Mhm.
There's actually a long history of like critical theory talking about professional wrestling. So it worked out.
Oh, yeah. So
Yeah.
when you mentioned that you were surprised you got this book got to you from Jonathan, like, did you already do a story in tweets before, like, like in terms of where they were up at the story, given that they added like another 5 years worth of story written?
I had actually there's a web page called Spectacle of Excess,
Hmm.
which encouraged me. They had a bunch of different people contributing, and so they encouraged me to write. And after a while, I was kind of like, I think I could actually write this up. So I had written up basically a version of Kevin and El Generico's story. It was a little rough, but I was able to usually to cannibalize some of it to get into the book, and that's where I had gotten used to the idea of, okay, you can start to piece this together. On the webpage, I could put up GIFs, so I
Hmm.
hadn't quite weaned myself off of the GIFs yet, but it was a good middle ground between Twitter and going without any GIFs at all. So that was, I thought, a good sort of halfway point.
Yeah, and you mentioned that you went started from Twitter for your creative writing with the GIF. So the GIF explains itself, but you also kind of give some context to it.
Mhm.
Then you dump into the middle portion, and then you write the full length book. Did you feel that process was really helpful in terms of basically making it into like a step by step process on how to create the essentially the finished product of your story?
Yeah, it was. It's interesting because I was listening to you interview somebody else, and you were asking about the were you a pantser or a planner,
Yeah,
basically.
yeah, it's classic.
And I couldn't. I was kind of like, what am I? And I was like, I don't tend to write more than one draft. And now just talking to you, I was like, no, that's not true,
Mm-mm.
because I wrote rough drafts of this whole book on this web page without even really realizing it,
Mhm.
and was able to look at it and go, something about that one doesn't work. A lot of I was able to take large swaths of some of them, and then others had too much of me in them,
Mhm.
because when I was writing for the webpage, I put a lot of my own reactions to wrestling and my own history with wrestling.
Mhm.
And I knew that all had to come out because it was irrelevant to the specific history I was telling. But it was really good for sort of checking and seeing, because I could see which of my essays had gotten more people's responding to them. So I knew what kind of writing was clicking with people, which was really helpful.
It's one of my favorite things to tell new writers is get as many reps and put them out in public as
Hmm.
best you can. I know it's hard. I know it's probably the most scariest thing for writers to put themselves out there, but you have to do it. If nothing more than to start getting that thick skin to get over that hump. And wrestling fans, as you know, can be some of the cruelest,
Hmm. Oh my
harshest
God.
critics of everything. Of
Oh my God.
everything. So, it's for you. I can't imagine just taking this story that people love so dearly and it's close to a lot of people's hearts, and for you to put it out there. That's impressive to me that you were able to have that, that fortitude just to go through and just continue on with it. And
I'm still waiting because of course there's no such thing as a neutral history.
no, never.
And so there's my opinions about what some of these stories meant is definitely there in the book, and I keep waiting for someone to be like, well, this chapter is bullshit.
Mhm,
You're just totally wrong about the way you're reading Sammy's character here, but
mhm.
so far it hasn't happened.
I personally, I think getting Kevin, and I saw the tweet. I think getting Kevin's stamp
Does
of
help.
approval
That
helps a
does help.
ton. Helps a ton because
Hmm.
that goes a long way in terms of credit for, like, giving you credibility. And I think a lot of like authors who do nonfiction, like look backs at the stories that we tell. I think that typically is lacking is sometimes you don't get that like thumbs up from the primary people involved. And
It
for
is rare, isn't it? It's like armor,
Yeah,
you
and I
know.
think truthfully getting that stamp of approval from Kevin, and getting that, getting this publicized by Kevin and getting it out there with Big E as well.
Hmm.
It's incredible to me that,
Another gift.
I think people will take your story a little more seriously personally. I think they'll take it a little more like, oh, this is approved by a person in this story. And for a lot of biographies, it feels like unless it's an autobiography, there's always like this question in people's minds. So how was it from that perspective as you're telling the story, when you're talking to Kevin and talking to Sammy, you mentioned that they didn't have a lot to like contradict you in any way, but like how validating was that experience totally knowing that you had written a story and you felt good like how they presented both of them?
Yeah, it was wow, obviously really fantastic. I mean, it was just it's I don't know, it's hard to describe, isn't it?
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
one
it
of those,
is.
it's not very often that you get the person that you've written a book about saying, "Yeah, okay, this book is good and I approve of it."
Mhm, and that's an
You know?
autobiography, unless they wrote it,
Yeah.
unless they got
Right.
someone to ghostwrite it for them.
It's
And in
about
this
me,
case, you
so of
went
course
into
I
it.
like it.
And in this case, you wrote the whole thing and had to add the interview after the fact. And the fact that
Yeah.
Kevin is out here promoting the book for you and helping promote the book for you, it's fantastic. And I think that truly gives it a good stamp of approval. I think anyone who comes out and has anything disparaging, truthfully, to say about the actual book itself, I think personally might have to answer to Kevin, who's not always the
Who's
most
not a
hush.
restrained person on
Yes,
Twitter
he is
now.
not restrained when it comes to when you say
Yeah.
something is blatantly wrong about him, he will come out and correct you.
Is wrestling fans are scary though.
They are scary.
I
They
live
are.
in constant fear of getting a move wrong.
Yep.
And it does happen. It happens.
Mhm. It happens a
And they
lot
will
of
show up to
times.
tell you that that stunner is a cutter. You called that a
Mhm.
stunner, and
Yep.
it's cutter.
It's
You
it's
messed
that
that one
weird
up.
it's just weird inside baseball, like
Yep.
this
Yep.
sense of like I think, part of it has to do I think they're more rabid than just romance readers. They will consume more than the romance reader. I am firmly believe that. I am putting this out there that, if you want to write like the next great romance novel, make it a pro wrestling romance.
I wonder, there must be some out there. I know I saw a manga at
I
one
know
point
there's
that was a romance between a pro wrestler and a female
yeah,
fan.
there's a couple out there, but
Which
it's just one of those things where I feel like hockey romances massive in this right now
that's
in
true.
this market. So it's just like to me, I feel there's something you can do. I think there's something that for anyone out there, and you know what? And if you do it right and you do it where it's like both like balance that fine line between like cheesy romance and and add some masculinity, like Titanic. I think Titanic's the ideal movie because it's like how they used to call. I don't know how old you are, but I'm going to assume that you know about the two tapes.
Hmm.
How the joke has always been the first tape is romance and the second tape is action. That's the ideal. I think that would be the ideal wrestling romance.
That's interesting. Yeah.
When you break it down like that. But I mean, that's what I think that's what scares me about writing about anything pro wrestling is that there's always going to be someone's like, oh, that's not cool, or they're so
Yeah.
tribal. They're either tribalistic, or it's like,
Hmm.
or there's know it alls. There's always someone who knows more than you. It's like
There's a
it's
lot of gatekeeping.
yeah. There's a ton of gatekeeping, and I
It is a
think that's what.
very gatekeeping heavy sort of
Mhm.
fandom. Yeah.
It is a very gatekeeping kind of fandom, and it's just weird to me how, we unless you grew up in like another country, we all got introduced to this crazy thing through the evilness of Vince McMahon. you
That's
know, Yeah, it's kind of weird. Like the average American fan probably started in between that wonderful era between 1996 and 1999. Like the average, and it just got passed down. But that's another podcast. We're not to go too far into that. But I think truthfully, when I'm reading your book and just going back to the writing, you know, how did you feel after it was all done that you balanced that academic like analysis of the bigger picture story
Mhm.
with getting people sucked into the story?
Um, yeah, I had to go back and rewrite the first chapter a little bit
Hmm.
because looking back at it, I was like, it starts off really dry.
Hmm.
It felt kind of like a Wikipedia article at first,
Okay.
like here are some facts about Sami Zayn and Kevin Owens. And so I didn't feel like it sucked anybody in at first. And I
Hmm.
knew the beginning had to be, you have to, especially with something as complex as this, it kind of had to
Hmm.
catch people. So it was very interesting to go back. Once I got the whole book written, I was like, okay, now I feel like I can say what the story's about. And I couldn't before I wrote. Didn't until I had written it, I didn't really know how to really describe the themes in the book.
Hmm.
I'm sure that I remember I had to do the same thing with my PhD thesis. I
Hmm.
wrote a beginning and then finished it and came back and rewrote the beginning again because I had to.
How important is it to kind of like when you're able to you write a beginning just for it seems like it's just a placeholder sometimes, and being able to take that full story and take that step back and be like, here's where they end up, here's how they get there. So where did they begin? So
Yeah.
is that kind of like the angle you went through and kind of when describing like that opening chapter a little bit in terms of like how do you choose to go with that specific point in time to start everyone off and then do a whole in media res thing, so to speak.
Yeah, it was hard. It was really hard to know where to start.
Hmm.
Uh there was a I didn't want to dwell too much because this is the story of the characters and not the real
Hmm.
people again.
Hmm.
So I didn't feel the pressure to. In fact, I felt a pressure not to include a whole lot of biographical details of
Yep.
their lives before they started wrestling.
Hmm.
And mostly, if it isn't public knowledge in the wrestling world, I left it out. But I
Okay.
will tell you, for example, I was so thrilled uh, when Kevin was wrestling. Oh Lord, it's so hard to explain to a non-wrestling fan, which is not you, but to other people watching. Kevin was wrestling a person who is the son of a famous wrestler
Hmm.
who used to wear a shirt that said "The American Dream, the son
I
of a
know
plumber."
exactly what it is. I think
Yep.
think enough people know who Dusty Rhodes is. I
Okay,
think I
good.
think I think there's like
And when Kevin was wrestling Dusty Rhodes' son,
yep,
he
Cody.
came out wearing a T-shirt saying "The Canadian Dream, the son of a security technician,
Yep, I remember that.
security
I
engineer."
laughed.
And I jumped to my feet. I was like, because I didn't know what his father did for a living, and so I couldn't put it into the book, and I
Hmm.
wanted to. And so when he came out wearing that shirt, I was like, yes, yes, I can go back and add that
What
he
he
was the
did, father
son
did.
of a security systems technician.
Hmm.
And I was so happy about that. But for example, I don't know Sammy's parents' names.
Yeah, and it's
He's
not
never
relevant to the
said
story.
them.
Yeah.
Yeah, it isn't. But it is very weird to write a biography where you don't mention the names of the main characters in some ways. I think it works out fine, but it was very odd to sort of start as in media res as possible with sort of
Hmm.
like this guy bought a WrestleMania VCR tape and brought it home to his son, and that's where our story begins,
Hmm.
basically.
Yep.
Yeah.
It's kind of funny that you mentioned the not knowing parents' names, but when part of Kevin Owens' story is his son and how his family motivates him. It's kind of funny. His name is Owen Owens,
It is
and
Owen
and that
Owens.
it is Owen Owens in in the WWE universe. But the point is that it's just it's fascinating that how like you mentioned that you were writing a biography about characters in a fictional world. So it's just like it was like you have to pull details from literal source material, which up until he wore that shirt in January, it really wasn't it
It
really
wasn't
wasn't a
canon,
thing what it
right?
did. It wasn't canon.
Yeah.
So when you're working on from that perspective, like how did you sift through like oh, this is officially canon, and what's officially like, what's not considered not canon
Well, with Kevin, it's easy because if Kevin mentions it, it's canon because his character is so close to his real
to
person.
home. Yeah, it's close to home.
With Generico, it's a little tougher. With El Generico, it's a little tougher because El Generico couldn't talk. A lot of
Mhm,
the backstory of El Generico was created more or less by fans, by bookers, by commentators,
mhm,
and so you. In another way, that's great because you kind of could pick and choose. Some things stuck and some things didn't, and
mhm,
over time, you could kind of see what the character was collecting as a backstory,
mhm.
which was really fascinating.
So, I know I'm not gonna get to it in the book, but I wanna ask, how did you
Mhm.
transition? How did you handle the transition from a Generico to Sami Zayn as a character from the perspective of his writer?
I got to when I was writing for the web page,
Mhm,
I very, very sort of earnestly wrote a goodbye to El Generico
mhm,
about how he became a legend, he rode off into the sunset and was never seen again.
mhm,
In the book, I can't really get away with doing that,
mhm,
no, because he has to continue onward and become Sami Zayn. But at a certain level, I love focusing on El Generico as that sort of he's a
mhm.
folk hero. He's like
Yep,
Paul Bunyan.
yep.
And when I talked to Sammy, actually, that was one of the great things I got out of talking to Sammy is he felt that way really strongly. That El Generico is best as a sort of uh, yeah, a folk tale, a
Mhm,
folk hero created out of the audience's collective fantasies almost. Some things that people said about El Generico didn't stick, but the minute commentary said that he had an orphanage of kids, fans just loved that.
mhm,
The idea that he was actually fighting to send money home to all of these adorable little orphans.
mhm,
Suddenly, fans would mention it all the time. Other wrestlers mentioned it all the time, and it just became more and more real.
mhm.
And it's nothing that Sammy did. He didn't have anything to do with that.
No,
So
he
much
just
of El
wrote it.
Generico's story was created by other people, which I
Mhm,
think I think really adds to Sammy's feeling about him as a separate thing almost.
mhm.
When he talks about El Generico, which he almost never does, which was
Yep.
part of it was a real thrill talking to him because he talked about El Generico,
Mhm.
um, and referred to El Generico as very much like a
Separate
separate
person.
thing from
Mhm,
him. Like not that he wasn't pretending that he wasn't El Generico,
mhm,
but it just felt very sort of closed off. Like this is a thing that happened and it's done and it's complete, which
mhm.
was really interesting.
Yeah, so when I read the book, when I finish it at that point where it does turn into where the story takes from El Generic versus Kevin Steen to the next chapter, which is
Yeah.
Sami Zayn and Kevin Owens. It's one of those things where it just feels it's kind of hard. It feels like it would be an incredibly difficult task to transition
It
from a
was a challenge.
non-speak.
I think I kind of stalled out writing there for a while
Mhm.
because it
Okay.
was just kind of hard to figure out. I don't think I ever used this metaphor in the book, but I always kind of feel like it's the equivalent of Pinocchio suddenly becoming a real boy.
Oh, that's a good
El
way to put it.
Generico is this cartoony, bouncy, two-dimensional character, and then suddenly there's Sammy, and he's clearly continuing from El Generico, but he's so rounded and
Mhm,
three-dimensional and real that it always feels that way to me. That like it's a puppet come to life all of a sudden and finds
mhm,
himself suddenly in NXT, three-dimensional and real. It's really
mhm.
interesting.
Yeah, I'm really interested to see how that transitions in the book because it's such a from as as you talk about how you're looking at it from the essentially kayfabe point of view.
Hmm.
How does El Generico's story wrap into Sami Zayn's story? Because Kevin Owens is the constant.
Yep.
Kevin Steen and Kevin Owens is a constant thread. It's just Generico Sami Zayn is the one that's kind of like, well, how do we get there? So I'm really interested when I get to that point in the book how you
I know
attack it.
part of what I ended up having to do was for that stretch of time when El Generico was gone, but there was no Sami Zayn yet.
Mhm,
There's a few months where he goes to NXT and he doesn't have a name.
mhm.
And he can't get anyone to accept a name. He keeps showing these lists of names to people and they reject them over and over again. And so I have to keep calling him, the man who is no longer El Generico. The man who is about to become Sami Zayn because he isn't anything fictionally at that time. It's
Yeah.
really interesting. He suddenly has no name whatsoever. He's just
Mhm.
sort of this, because I'm it isn't that I refuse to call him Rami Sabeh in the book,
It just
but
doesn't fit.
on the whole, it's not his fictional name at all.
No.
That's the name on his passport.
Mhm.
That's the name on the passport of the person who plays these characters, which is just a
Yeah.
totally different thing. So
Yeah, and I call him Sammy just because pro wrestlers love calling them by their
yeah,
work
yeah.
name for some reason. I don't understand this. They call him by their work name. But I've always viewed it as like Rami and Sammy, while they're of the same ideological cloth, they're still two
They're
different because
still different. Yeah.
Rami will go home to his wife, and like they're the same person, like the same wife, but
They have,
they're
yeah, yeah. It's the
but they're
same
treated
wife.
differently. But it's like treated very differently. Like how I'm
Hmm.
like I don't imagine as Sammy. I don't imagine Rami or like Rami just going around like just being goofy all the time. I don't imagine. I'm sure he's a
Yeah.
fun guy. I'm sure he's a fun guy,
But he's
but
not
it's one of
Sammy.
he's not Sammy.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
a different person underneath there.
Yeah.
And I think the challenge that I think when you're looking at it from a canon point of view is that there is ultimately that awkward middle of how we get from Generico to Sami Zayn. I think
Yeah.
that is to me
It's
as
awkward all around. It's very
when you're
awkward
looking
for
at
him.
I think for I guess there's no clean explanation. I think that's
Yeah.
part of it. I think from a constructive story, like looking at strictly non-pro wrestling, but strictly story based, it's like how do you like and Sammy doesn't even want to like go with the route that's I'm trained by El Generico. He doesn't even go with that route. It's the
Yeah. No.
easiest out for him. He doesn't. And that tells me that he wants something more nuanced than something to be like, "Oh, I'm
Hmm.
the student of El Generico." I'm like, while we would accept it as wrestling fans and as
Yep.
like people who analyze the art form and the writing, I think that
That's not
speaks
what he
much to.
wants.
That's not what he wants. I think that speaks to the person who plays the characters. I think that speaks
Hmm.
to, just overall, I just feel like there's so many easy outs that he could have like done to kind of explain that transition. The fact that there's this like mystery behind it, canonically,
Yeah.
makes it more both real and also
Isn't that
like a little
interesting? You're
obscene.
right. It feels more real and more mythical at the same
Yeah.
time.
Yeah, it's this weird and I think that's what pro wrestling does. I think
Hmm.
that's what it needs to do. At its best, it needs to balance the real with the mythical.
Hmm.
I think that's what it
A
comes
really good
down
way
to.
to put it.
I think that's what pro wrestling needs to do. I think that's what makes I think that's why there's such a disconnect with a lot of like American pro wrestling because you don't have the luxury of having like could you imagine if Sami Zayn and Kevin Owens had this story strictly in WWE the entire length of their career? There's no shot. It would not
Couldn't
be as
have.
deep.
Yeah.
It would not be as deep. It would not be as compelling. It wouldn't even have this sense of mystery because it's like what happened to the generic guy? Oh, he's in Mexico running his orphanage. But it's just this feels like this whole like it would just not be the same. It would just
Hmm.
not be the same.
Yeah.
Like
Why
I
not?
think because given how WWE writes their stories versus like say like back in the early 90s with All Japan, it's just a very different type of storytelling between the two promotions. And I think that's what it really comes down to difficulties. I think that's something that I do like ultimately I do want to like hopefully one of these days write the book on um how wrestling storytelling differs between the
That would
various
be a great book. That would be really interesting.
the three major regions, which is America, Japan, Mexico. Because if
Hmm.
you look at it from the storytelling perspective, a lot of like lucha libre storytelling is like their mask. You lose your mask to someone and you have a son who's wrestling, the story now becomes can your son avenge you for this mask loss?
Hmm.
It's one of the simplest stories they always tell. Japan, four pillars. We have so many examples of it. It's just we could go down the list, and
I
America is just
always
like,
love, yeah, the part of what's fascinating to me is you can always tell when two wrestlers who have spent a lot of time in Japan meet in an American match.
mm-hmm,
There's usually, you can often tell they're wrestling a Japanese match now.
mm-hmm,
They'll
yep,
start off the match Japanese style, for
yep,
example, and you can
yep.
feel the difference. It's really
Mm-hmm.
interesting.
It's so interesting, and I think there's the idea of callbacks. I think that
Hmm.
it wasn't necessarily a very big thing until we see it in the early '90s with All Japan. The
Hmm.
concept that what you did in the prior match has implications
Still
in the match
matters.
later
People will
on.
remember it,
Yeah,
and
people
people will
remember,
do
and
it.
I think that's what I think it was funny. I think I read a line from Kevin, like he doesn't want to insult the fans. He
Hmm.
know they
Yeah,
know. Like I think the
he's
firstly
mentioned
the
that recently. Yeah.
he's one of those guys who doesn't want to insult fans. So part of me has always wanted to be like, just to come on and say, you used to be this guy, like the Elias storyline. You're Elias. And then he's like, you're Generico. I'm like, no, I'm not. It'd just be hilarious for just once to just go. Like,
Yeah,
I think that would add more to your story. I think that would be more comedic as
it
elements
would
to
be
your
really
story.
interesting.
But I mean, that's the type of thing in storytelling and pro wrestling. I think, and this is also a storytelling podcast, but these types of stories, they're simple, they're very simple, they're very direct, but
Hmm.
there's so many different twists and turns that come a long way, because if you give everyone a commonality goal, which is in pro
A
wrestling should
title.
be the title or being the best,
Yeah.
which is defined by being the title, it creates for so many struggles and push and pulls, and I think that's what creates so much drama. And I think, I really want to look into this. Like, I want to like really write that book that I mentioned to you. Like, it's just one of those things that I just need to
Yeah.
sit down and research it and kind of like look at like storytelling of the '70s in Japan. Like, because if you remember the stories of Japan's pro wrestling history, it was a national recovery period for that country.
Hmm.
One of my favorite things to tell people: you look at the history of each region of the big three regions of pro wrestling. You look at their origins. Look at where they are today, very similar in how they approach it conceptually. You have the
It's interesting.
carnies
Hmm.
of pro wrestling America, which is fool the audience and kind of convince them. You have the sport based nationalistic pride of Japan. And then you have the very colorful Aztec
Carnival. Yeah.
aspect carnival like of lucha libre, which is very Aztec based with the mask and the colors, and it always goes back to how the sport originated. And it's just one of those fascinating things that when people ask me how much do you love pro wrestling, I'm like, that's that let me get you into this. Let me explain to you this. Like,
Sit
this
down.
is how I approach it, like from the storytelling standpoint. So for you, as someone now who has gotten into pro wrestling recently, how do you basically look at it from a storytelling perspective?
Part of what I really love about wrestling storytelling is that that thing that you said, as you mentioned, has only really started to kick in the last, I mean, recently, the last 30, 40 years.
Mhm,
The idea that you could tell a story across decades is amazing to me. And
mhm,
I mean, Kevin and Sami are, I think, one of the pinnacles of it, but there are other people doing it. I'm a huge fan of Tetsuya Naito's,
yep, very
and this
popular.
whole complex, long love story, hate story with the fans that he has going on.
One of my favorite stories. By far
They're
one of my
just,
favorite stories.
yeah. Oh, I was there when he won the. I was there when he won the big one at the Tokyo
Ah.
Dome. It was
And then they added
amazing.
another chapter by not giving him his roll call. I'm like, this is this
Yeah.
is this
Yes.
is
Oh, we were so mad.
oh, they
But
were
he has
so
this
mad.
incredibly long story, and this he has a relationship with the Intercontinental title that takes
Mhm.
on all these twists and turns, and
Mhm.
just that ability to take in Tetsuya Naito's case. What happened was something very organic. The audience decided that they hated him,
Mhm.
and they weren't supposed to. He was supposed to be the new rising star good guy,
Mhm.
and the audience was just like, no, no, we've decided we hate him.
Mhm.
And he had to leave and go to Mexico and reinvent himself, and having to work with an audience that is not always going to work with you. It's this
Mhm.
weird long-term improvisation that your audience has input, into where your story is going, and they are not always going to help you with it. Roman Reigns has a similar sort of thing where he was
Mhm.
supposed to be their big top babyface, and the audience just would have none of it,
Mhm.
and have forced him onto this long, winding story that goes nowhere where it was supposed to. They had to keep winging it and changing
Mhm.
it as they went. And it's just this story where the fans can kind of grab the reins
Mhm.
and change the story is really fascinating. You don't see much like that.
In
That
other
that
form of media, yeah,
ability.
you don't.
Yeah.
It's like the ultimate choose your adventure with a bunch of like 10,000 of your friends.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, that's probably the best part. Well,
And
I
and the
just,
guy in the back going, "Don't choose that one.
yeah, that's
No,
exactly it.
don't do that."
And and I think truthfully they've gotten I think the performers have gotten better about it. The wrestlers have gotten
Mhm.
better about it, and I think the writers and the bookers have gotten significantly
Yeah,
better
they've
about
gotten a lot more
approach.
agile about it and a lot
Yeah,
more willing to say, "Oh, well, okay, that's not working. I guess we're gonna have to change our approach."
yeah. I think that agility. I think that's why it's so hard to write for WWE. I think it's one of the hardest jobs you could ever do because of how agile you have to be as a writer. Because
Every time they have an opening for a new writer, I always get a couple of people being like, "You should apply." And I'm like, "I would rather die than work for
yep, I would
WWE
rather do a
because
lot
I
of
would throw
things.
myself off a bridge in about a week." That
Yes,
is
because
one of the most high stress jobs I can imagine.
mhm.
It's just it sounds like a nightmare.
Oh,
No, thank you.
as two creatives, I assume it's one of the worst.
Yeah.
Just because of because of how quickly things can change on you on a dime.
Mm-hmm.
And just there's this like neurological like feeling of control when we're writing something and we want it to be great. We want it to be our baby. And for someone to tell you it's not good enough, go. And for people to reject it openly is the worst part.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to change it again. And the fact that you have to come to work knowing that there's a chance that 10,000 people in one arena could reject what you have just written.
Mm-hmm.
That is terrifying.
Or even, I mean, not even the full rejection, but just the idea that very often you plan out this whole thing and then you start off on it, and that night somebody breaks their leg.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well,
Yep.
oh, your main character is out for 7 months now. Oh,
Mhm.
and there's
Well,
no replacing him. You can't recast.
mhm.
You're
There's no
just, that's it. That's the whole story that you
adjust on the
just
fly.
worked on is gone now.
I'm
Would
sure there's a
I?
story behind Sami and John Cena that was supposed to come
Yeah,
after that
right?
that shoulder injury threw things
And
for
we'll
a
never
loop.
know.
We will never know, and I think that's one of the most stressful things about writing for the WWE. I think as a
Yeah.
creative, I can't imagine doing it. I think that's. I'm glad someone else agrees with me on terms of like that the difficulty of like approaching that whole. Because I'm sure we can. It's one of those things where I think we're seeing it with AEW a little bit. It's
Hmm.
not just writing; you have to control the egos of people as
Yeah,
well.
that's going to be a challenge too.
Yeah, so I think it's one of the biggest challenges of like you have a story. One, okay, not only can the fans reject it, the performers can also reject it,
And
and
because it's all live,
mhm,
it's all live. There's no retakes. If a
mhm,
performer decides to go off script, you just have to deal with it.
mhm.
I mean, you can
Reprimand all you want, but
yeah, you can reprimand them after. But
but now you have to
and
work with what
and
they said.
I'm sure there's a lot of times where they're like, well, a good example of this is apparently when Cody Rhodes was told you're not actually going to win the Royal Rumble, or
Yeah,
rather,
that's
you
a good
won the Royal
example.
Rumble, but you're not going to be able to fight Roman Reigns. You have to go out there and look happy to give up your opportunity. And whether on purpose or not, he went out there and looked miserable. And I'm sure the writers were like, "No, you have to look like this is an honor to give up your place." And you didn't.
You
And
did.
that changed the story because the fans were like, "Hey, he looks miserable and we're not thrilled about that." You
Oh
know?
yeah, and once again, it's like whatever the long term plan is, we don't never know. Like we'll never know.
Yeah.
Truthfully, we'll never know what the original plan was for that main event. But if the original plan was it was supposed to be, and Cody comes out being miserable, why shouldn't he? Why should he not be
Right.
miserable? He's
Why
being
would he look
openly
happy?
told that you're not going to
I'm sure
face
Cody
the guy
Rhodes in the
you're
back is
chasing.
like, it would not really fit my character to be happy about
Yeah,
this. So. But
it's
yeah, you've
there's
got a situation where you're writing a story and your audience can insist on the story changing and your characters can rebel against you.
mm-hmm,
Your characters can undermine you.
mm-hmm.
Would be so stressful.
Yeah, definitely. It would be
Insane.
it would be insane, and I'm glad that that's one of the things that people don't understand, like how difficult it is to how difficult the whole industry of pro wrestling is.
Yeah.
Between the writing, between the booking, between the handling of the locker room, between the performances, it trickles down. It does take special people to do
Hmm.
what they do. And I think that's the most important thing when it comes to creatives that we can do is just appreciate the stories that we're given sometimes. And I think you've done a fantastic job so far of recapping one of the best stories in the past 20 years of between Sami Zayn and Kevin Owens. I think
It's
to
an
me
amazing story.
it is fantastic. So, where can we find this book? I mean, as we wrap up here, like, where can we find this book and what is it called?
Um, it's out on Amazon
Mhm.
and on Barnes and Noble, and my publisher has mentioned. And if you do not want to use Amazon, which I can understand,
Yep.
you can also go to a local bookseller and give them the ISBN, and they're very often willing to order it that way. So if you
Oh,
would like to dodge the big chain booksellers,
mhm.
that's another option.
Nice.
Yeah, I was
Awesome.
happy about that.
Well, I really love the conversation. That's been fantastic because I rarely can intersect everything about my life, which is pro wrestling, writing, academia,
Academics.
academics, and just it's just you hit a lot of. That's why I gave myself 90 minutes. I'm like I want
I
I want as
appreciate
much
it.
I want this to be something like I want this to be like a really big something special because I really do feel that a lot of people, look down on pro wrestling to a degree. And I don't I understand that the predetermined nature can turn people off. But what else is
But
regular?
nobody goes in saying, "Look, need to not know if Spider-Man's going to live or die." Of
Yeah.
course he's gonna succeed. You know,
Hmm.
it's predetermined.
Yeah.
You know,
And the thing is that I think the best thing about pro wrestling, and I always tell people this, is imagine like very rarely, very, very rarely do you not get a payoff at some point. You'll always get paid off in one moment or another. And you'll get a payoff. Whether it's the one you want, that's not in your control, but
there is
you will
that.
get.
Yeah,
I mean, would I have preferred Sammy winning in Montreal over Roman Reigns? But yeah, but it doesn't make sense for the longer story. It didn't make sense at the time.
we got a good payoff.
We got a
Yeah,
payoff. I think him and Kevin winning main eventing WrestleMania was the moment we're all looking for.
makes a great end to my book.
Oh, I bet. And then you probably were wondering, oh, great, here they have one more fantastic match
Yep, yep,
right before Kevin
and
has to leave for neck surgery.
yep. Oh God, that was rough too. Oh, my
Oh,
book is out, and Kevin has gotten badly injured.
yes. I mean, to be fair, like,
So we'll be
and
waiting. We'll hope.
well,
We'll hope he'll
it
make it
will be a
back.
while. Like for the fans to
Yeah.
for fans who don't know pro wrestling, he suffered a major injury. He will need a lot of time off. But if there's anyone who has put his heart, and there's not a chance, there's even a chance he might retire. And as much as as for the fans who don't know pro wrestling, it's one of those things where he has given everything. He's told his stories, got his moments, made money along the way,
Yep. Got to main
and
event WrestleMania with
man,
Stone Cold
twice,
Steve Austin. Yeah.
twice, yeah, he wrestled a
Yeah.
hero of his. It's he's done well for himself. So, well, thank you again for coming on the show. I really
Thank you
appreciate
so
it.
much for having me. It's been
Nope.
a lot of fun. I've been talking pro wrestling with people, but I haven't talked much about writing about pro wrestling, which
Oh,
has
I
been
bet. I think
really
writing and
fun.
I think we did a good job mixing it all together. I think
Yeah, it
we
was great. Thank you.
and truthfully, it's just like if you ever have another book, I will gladly have you on. It's one of those things where you know
Fantastic.
I really
And I
appreciate your
hope to
time.
I hope to read your history of the three territories sometime.
If I
Plenty
could
of
get a publisher
music.
to help me, if truthfully, if you want to put me in contact with Jonathan, I'll gladly start working on it.
I would love to read it. So
Yeah, I think just I think truthfully the three types of storytelling is the most compelling to me and how
mm,
they all have because the pro wrestling world has become so flat per se in terms of like how accessible everything is and how
hmm.
we can watch these things, how it's
Yeah.
become a melting pot, how all these types of stories are now coming together and like, the luchas de apuestas matches are coming to North America and Japan and the
Hmm.
sports-based presentation, long-term storytelling of Japan and the national and the sports-based presentation and just the craziness that comes with American pro wrestling and DDT. It's just how the melting pot has become so how the pot of pro wrestling has gotten so joined,
Hmm.
but we gotta look at it from its humble beginnings, and it's not just and I think I read a comic that was like the history of pro wrestling. That
Yes,
did
I
a good
read that
job.
too. It's a really good book.
It's a really good comic. I feel that we can go deeper
Mm-hmm.
with the research and going
Yeah.
like look like you go deeper with research. And I think, I want to write the book. I just need to kind of like the push you had,
Yep. Yep.
Well, awesome. Well, thank you again. Thank you everyone
Thank
for
you so
listening, and
much.
we'll talk
Yeah.
everyone soon.